Ethnobotany and the Nuaulu world of plants. Although I had been acquiring data on Nuaulu knowledge of plants from the very beginning of my work on Seram, it was only from 1995 onwards that I was able to devote my time single-mindedly to collecting voucher specimens. The same was true of the work on the sago palm, which, as you've seen from some of the previous films, was a central cultural feature of the Moluccan landscape, and which I had demonstrated much earlier to be a cultural keystone species. So my work on Nuaulu animal classification somehow morphed imperceptibly into my work on Nuaulu plant knowledge. The theoretical questions were to a great extent the same. I had begun my ethnobotanical observations in 1970 as part of a general fieldwork program. Indeed, I had some assistance from the Singapore Botanic Gardens, but frankly, I needed to do much more serious plant collecting to support my hypotheses. Ethnobotany became a major preoccupation with the award of an ESRC grant, Economic and Social Research Council grant, for the study of ecology and ethnobiology of human rainforest interaction in 1989 onwards. This work took me both to Brunei in 1989 and then a second project on deforestation and forest knowledge in central Seram took me back to Seram in 1995 onwards. There was a separate grant which sort of interacted with these same issues, specifically devoted to the role of the sago palm on ethnography, ethnobotany, and the dispersal of palm starch. That was from 2002 onwards. These were all ostensibly focused on the issue of forest change and the local knowledge that accompanied and changed accordingly. But they all involved some quite detailed work on plants themselves. It was the second deforestation grant that permitted this, together with collaboration with the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, especially with a botanist called Mark Code, and also with the National Indonesian Herbarium at Bogor. This allowed me to advance my systematic Nuaulu work. The ethnobotanical turn in my research interests also accompanied my involvement in new professional organizations and new collaborative links. I had been a founder member of the American Society of Ethnobiology from its early newsletter phase, attended some of its conferences, some of these connections going back to the Canterbury Seminar on classifications in their social context. For example, my work with Jean Hun. I had attended some of its early conferences and visited St. Louis, where the suave Peter Raven presided over impressive fundraising soirees at the Botanic Gardens there. But I also became involved with the International Society of Ethnobiology, founded by Darrell Posey and others, which was not only more international, more internationalist, but from the beginning sought to build bridges between local and indigenous people and the scientists and anthropologists studying them or studying their knowledge. The ISE drew up protocols for the best ethical practice, for the handling of intellectual property and equitable partnerships. The Brunei project, which I mentioned earlier, provided for some valuable methodological experience. But it was the launching of the Kent postgraduate ethnobotany program jointly with Kew and the subsequent founding of the Centre for Ethnobiology at Kent that provided a robust research infrastructure together with intellectual stimulation to complete the program of work on which I had embarked. This would not have been possible without the support of Ian Prance, who at that time was the director of Kew, and who was well aware of the international demand for qualifications in the subject. And Gary Martin, a student of Brent Berlin's, who went on to inaugurate an important NGO, the Global Diversity Foundation. The work on Nuaulu plant classification was not finished until just a few years ago, 2020, and was marked by the appearance of the Nuaulu world of plants, ethnobotanical cognition, knowledge, and practice among a people of Seram. Its completion had been delayed by the demands of managing and teaching the Kent Kew ethnobotany program and the arrival of increasing numbers of research students as our reputation at Kent grew. The same project also allowed me to examine the extent to which Nuaulu fungal classification could be placed in the Berlinian framework, and I published on this in 2008 in the journal Economic Botany. All along, my main emphasis in investigating classifications used by people in making sense of their empirical knowledge of the environment has been their contingent character, the variation between individuals and groups in what they know and their judgment, and their flexibility while not denying some strong cross-cultural convergence in the form of cognitive ordering that arise more from commonalities of environmental experience than from having some kind of hard wiring in the brain. My main ethnobiological interests had since the 1970s been about the fundamental properties of ethnobiological classification. And some of this work was brought together in 2005 with the publication of a book, The Categorical Impulse, which was really a collection of essays on this theme. This was a collection of essays in the anthropology of classifying behavior. However, I had simultaneously been pursuing interests in the in-depth knowledge of particular cultivated species. Much of this has focused on the management of diversity within certain species. There was the work on sago palms, which I've referred to several times already, and which followed directly from my early interest in Nuaulu subsistence and the historical underpinnings of regional trade in spices. Not only was it possible to document a breadth of diversity and local knowledge than had hitherto been recorded in the Moluccas, but it could be shown how there was a cline for sago palm diversity running east to west across island Southeast Asia, from the parts of New Guinea where local terminologies mapped the most cultivar diversity to Johor in Malaysia and in West Sumatra, where sago diversity was restricted to just a few varieties. And this mirrored the spread of the palm over a period of some 10,000 years. Then there were the papers I collaborated on with my students. Johan Iskandar, among the Badui people living in a forest enclave in West Java. In one of these papers, we examined rice cultivar diversity, where the large numbers required different kinds of classifying strategy to those found in less diverse cultigens and in wild plants. In another, we looked at the role of an introduced tree, Parasyrianthus falcotaria, in maintaining sustainable swidden cultivation. Most recently has been a project conducted with my colleague Hermien Sosalisa, an anthropologist in Ambon, in which we looked at cassava, Maniote esculenta, in 3 different Moluccan populations. In terms of core studies of indigenous knowledge, cassava was different in being a relatively new introduced crop. And yet we were able to show how in not much more than a century, extraordinary levels of cassava diversity had been managed and labeled in the K Islands, such that it had become an iconic cultural marker. And through elaboration of the bitter, that is the toxic varieties, had allowed populations to adapt to an increasingly dry savanna environment. The Nuaulu, too, had adopted cassava, but here there was little diversification and no specialization of bitter varieties, mainly because the Nuaulu diet was balanced and sufficient, with access to plentiful sago in a wet tropical forest environment. An innovative feature of this collaborative work with Hermien Sosalisa was the use of both toxicity tests and DNA analysis. The latter was undertaken with Pajajaran University in Bandung, and as a result, we were able to demonstrate how K Island farmers had diversified their cassava phenotypes through selective cloning over a 150-year period, compared with the Nuaulu, who had shown little interest at all. In addition to the work on sago and cassava, I was to examine the ethnography and ethnobiology of other particular human-plant interactions, especially in relation to the management of diversity and its cultural refractions. Among these were the species combined in beetle chewing, the nut, areca, the pepper, and also the mineral lime that was used to chemically produce the desired psychoactive effects. I also looked at the nut-producing genus Canarium and how its domestication, diversification, and folk classification was linked to use in ritual and the creation of what I have come to call landscapes of exchange. I mean, if you look at the contemporary landscape of forest landscape of Ceram, it's very easy to see it as just enormous areas of tropical rainforest. In fact, it's been much modified, and even if we disregard the areas that have turned into plantation, for example, of clove, you still have these enormous patches of species of Canarium, which have not arisen simply through some kind of process of natural selection, but of cultural selection. These trees were important not only because local people were making use of their products, but because the nuts were harvested and then traded. And this is over a period of some thousands of years. An early critical assessment of ethnobotany as it existed up until the 1960s was that it was bereft of theory and tended to comprise merely lists of useful plants. So part of my work in this area has been to quite self-consciously make theoretical interventions. For example, in examining, as I did with Simon Platten, the social life of seeds through a study of the networks of relationships in the dispersal of cultural selection of plant germplasm. And this was not in Indonesia at all. What was focused on allotment holders in East Kent. So in a sense, the development of ethnobotany practice, research practice in exotic regions of the world was feeding into an understanding of human-plant interaction in more familiar and home settings. I also began to explore the underlying cultural and cognitive propensity for diversification and more generally the relationship between local knowledge systems and science as an ontological negotiation. This comes out in a paper published in the Journal of Ethnobiology called "Is There a Role for Ontologies in Understanding Plant Knowledge Systems?" And I also looked at understanding plants as social cultural objects. With Raj Puri, I worked on how we might conceptualize what we might call core medicinal floras through comparative work using data from both Borneo and Ceram. It seemed to me that there had been a tendency simply to list medicinal plants and not to see to what extent there were overlaps in different adjacent geographical areas. And indeed, what we found was there was surprisingly little overlap of the core plants that were used medicinally, and these were often very common ones throughout the region. But there was a great deal of adaptation, in particular pharmacopoeias using local species that were being used in other places. I also worked, and this was in the Brunei study, with Jay Bernstein and colleagues and in Brunei on how to produce plot surveys that might better be adapted for the needs of ethnobotanical research. And this work in 1997 went on to subsequently inform other work that I did. More grandly, perhaps, and more synthetically, I've attempted to show how the accumulated body of ethnobiological understanding since the late 1960s might shed light on the evolution of human cultural cognition more generally. This is a black hole in terms of our understanding of the evolution of plant knowledge and use, mainly because animal preservation is so much more evident than plant preservation. And of course, there is no reason to believe that right from the earliest times, Homo sapiens has not been making use of a great diversity of plants, in addition to the use of animals. So it seemed to me that at this stage in the development of ethnobotany, there was now sufficient accumulated knowledge and theoretical insights to begin to sort of retroject some understandings onto how humans had interacted with plants cognitively and practically from the earliest period. What links all this work together is the idea of biocultural diversity, that wherever there have been humans and other organisms have inevitably interacted and co-evolved, generating and reinforcing useful diversity. For me, ethnobiology has not been a subject sui generis, but has always been integral to my anthropology, addressing so many aspects of what it is that makes us human. I tackled issues around this idea in ethnobiology and the Science of Humankind, which was published as an REI journal special issue in 2016. And that's it for now.